The night manager looked at the exhausted man standing at the front desk with a sleeping 8-year-old on his shoulder, glanced at his wrinkled jacket and scuffed boots, and said the 5 words that were about to end her career. "We don't have rooms for people like you." What she didn't, what almost no one at the Cole Grand Hotel Chicago knew, was that the man she'd just turned away owned the building she was standing in, along with 41 others across the country. This is the story of Ethan Cole, and the one night, everything he'd built almost cost him the one thing that actually mattered. Ethan Cole was 39 years old, and for the past 4 years, he had been doing something none of his executives, none of his board members, and none of the 11,000 employees across Cole Hospitality Group had ever fully understood. Roughly once every 6 weeks, he disappeared. No security detail, no assistant, no advance notice to the property he was visiting. He would put on an ordinary jacket, drive an ordinary rental car, and check into one of his own hotels exactly the way any tired traveler off the interstate would, because Ethan had built his entire company on a single, stubborn belief his own father had taught him 30 years earlier, back when his father ran a single 12-room motel outside Peoria. You cannot know what your business actually is until you experience it as a stranger. Spreadsheets told you occupancy rates. Only walking through your own lobby unrecognized, at midnight, exhausted, told you the truth about how your staff treated a person who couldn't do anything for them. His father, Walter Cole, no relation to the sanitation worker of the same last name in another town entirely, just a coincidence of a common American surname, had run that 12-room motel for 11 years before slowly, stubbornly, building it into a small regional chain through nothing but relentless attention to a single principle he repeated to Ethan so many times growing up, that it had worn smooth in Ethan's memory like a river stone. "Son, you can tell everything you need to know about a business by watching how it treats the guest who can't do anything for it in return." Ethan had been 14 the first time his father made him work an entire summer as a bellhop under a fake name at one of their own smaller properties, specifically so Ethan would understand, from the inside, exactly what the job asked of the people who did it every day. He'd carried bags, cleaned lobbies, and watched, more than once, a manager treat a guest differently based on nothing but their appearance, and he's never forgotten the particular shame of realizing, at 14, how easily kindness could be rationed out based on assumptions that had nothing to do with a person's actual character. By the time Ethan inherited the company at 31, following his father's sudden retirement after a heart scare that finally convinced the old man to slow down, Cole Hospitality Group had grown to 14 properties across the Midwest. Ethan had spent the following 8 years expanding it to 42 hotels in 12 states, but he had never once stopped conducting the anonymous property checks his father started, because he'd watched, over those same 8 years, how easily a growing company could lose the migrate culture that made it worth building in the first place, if no one at the top ever bothered to check whether the values on the wall matched the behavior at the front desk. He always brought his daughter, Ava, on these trips. Not because it was convenient. A single father juggling a growing hospitality empire had exactly 0 convenient options for childcare on a Tuesday night in February, but because Ava had lost her mother, Sarah, 4 years earlier to a sudden cardiac condition no one had seen coming, and in the aftermath, Ethan had made a decision that shaped every choice he made afterward. Ava would never feel like she came second to the company, not even during a routine property inspection. So when duty called him to Chicago on a bitter February evening to quietly check on a flagship property that had been underperforming in guest satisfaction scores for 2 consecutive quarters, 8-year-old Ava came with him, wrapped in her favorite oversized coat, clutching a stuffed rabbit, with one ear worn thin from years of being carried through airports and rental cars and hotel lobbies just like this one. They had flown in from a delayed connection out of Denver, landed 2 hours late, sat in Chicago traffic behind an accident on the Kennedy Expressway, and by the time Ethan pulled the rental car up to the Cole Grand Hotel on North Michigan Avenue, it was 11:40 at night. Ava was fast asleep against his shoulder, and Ethan himself looked exactly like what he was pretending to be, a road-worn father who hadn't shaved in 2 days, wearing a jacket with a coffee stain on the sleeve from the airport, carrying a sleeping child and 2 overstuffed duffel bags because he'd forgotten, as he always seemed to forget on these trips, that traveling with an 8-year-old required approximately 4 times the luggage of traveling alone. He walked into the marble lobby of his own hotel, the one with his family's name etched in brushed gold letters above the reception desk, and approached the front desk, where a night manager named Kimberly Voss was midway through what had clearly been a difficult shift. Kimberly was 28, sharp-featured, competent by most measures her supervisors had ever evaluated her on, and utterly, catastrophically unable in that particular moment to separate the exhaustion of a 12-hour double shift from the judgment she was about to exercise on the man standing in front of her. "Reservation under Cole," Ethan said quietly, careful, as always on these trips, not to give his full name too quickly, watching for how the staff treated a name that meant nothing to them yet. Kimberly typed at her keyboard, frowned, typed again. "I'm not showing anything under that name for tonight," she said, in the particular clipped tone of someone who had already decided, before finishing the sentence, that this was not a problem she intended to solve. "We're actually sold out this evening. There's a conference in town." "I have a confirmation number," Ethan said, shifting Ava's weight gently on his shoulder, pulling out his phone with his free hand to show her the reservation, made, as always, under a shell corporation name specifically designed not to trigger any special treatment. "Cole Hospitality Group corporate rate, room 814. Kimberly glanced at the phone screen, then back at Ethan, at the coffee-stained jacket, the 2-day stubble, the scuffed boots that had walked through 3 different airports that day, the sleeping child drooling faintly on his shoulder, and something in her expression shifted into a kind of tired, dismissive certainty that Ethan had unfortunately seen before, in different cities, on different faces, though never quite this baldly stated. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion with whatever website you booked through. We don't have any availability tonight. And honestly," she glanced past him at the elegant lobby, at the small cluster of conference attendees in expensive suits laughing near the bar, then back at him, "this really isn't that kind of hotel. There's a Motel 6 about 15 minutes from here that might have better luck with your budget." The words landed in the quiet lobby with a particular kind of ugliness, the assumption dressed up as helpfulness, the casual cruelty of a woman who had decided, based on nothing but a stained jacket and an unshaven face, exactly what kind of man was standing in front of her, and exactly how much consideration he deserved. A security guard near the door, a heavy-set man named Frank Delgado, who had worked at the Cole Grand's overnight shift for 9 years, had drifted closer during the exchange, his body language shifting into the particular alert posture of someone anticipating trouble, though whether he intended to help Ethan or remove him wasn't yet clear. Ethan felt the old, familiar tightness rise in his chest, the same one he'd felt 11 years earlier, long before he inherited the company from his father, when he'd worked a single summer as a bellhop at a competitor's property, and watched a manager wave off an elderly black couple with a reservation because they didn't look like the type of guest we usually see here. He'd never forgotten how that felt to witness, and he'd sworn, the day he took over Cole Hospitality Group, that no employee under his name would ever be allowed to build a career on deciding, at a glance, who deserved dignity and who didn't. He didn't raise his voice. He simply shifted Ava carefully against his shoulder, feeling her stir slightly at the change in his posture, and said, quietly, "I'd like to speak to the general manager, please." "The general manager isn't in at this hour," Kimberly said, already turning slightly away, her attention drifting back toward her computer screen, toward the conference guests at the bar who represented, in her clearly practiced internal calculus, actual paying customers worth her time. "Like I said, sir, we're sold out. I really can't help you further tonight." It was at that exact moment that Frank Delgado, the security guard, stepped forward, not to remove Ethan, as Kimberly had perhaps expected, but to lean in close to her ear and say something too quiet for Ethan to hear. Kimberly's face went through a rapid, visible transformation. Confusion, disbelief, and finally, as she looked back at Ethan Cole with new and terrified attention, something close to pure panic. Frank had recognized him. Frank had worked the door at the Cole Grand's grand reopening gala 3 years earlier, had shaken Ethan's hand personally, had heard him give a short speech about the values the company was built on, and Frank, unlike Kimberly, had learned a long time ago in his own career never to assume anything about a tired-looking man carrying a sleeping child at midnight. Ms. Voss, Ethan said, and the use of her actual name, read directly off the small brass tag on her uniform, seemed to land harder than anything else he could have said. My name is Ethan Cole. I own this hotel, along with 41 others across the country, including the one your paycheck comes from. I've been standing at this desk for the last 4 minutes with my sleeping 8-year-old daughter on my shoulder, trying to get a room I have a confirmed reservation for, and you have suggested twice now that I don't belong here, based entirely, as far as I can tell, on the fact that I look tired and my jacket has a coffee stain on it. The lobby, which had been quietly humming with the low murmur of conference attendees, went suddenly and completely silent. Kimberly Voss's face drained of color entirely, her hands frozen above the keyboard, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. Mr. Cole, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Let me, she started, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush now, the practiced professional coldness of a moment earlier collapsing entirely into raw, visible fear. I know you had no idea, Ethan said, and something in his voice, though still quiet, carried an unmistakable weight now. That's exactly the problem, Ms. Voss. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like I belonged in this lobby. Every single person who walks through those doors tonight deserves the same basic respect you FOS have shown me in the last 4 minutes. If you have known my last name, match the one on the wall behind you. That's not a policy I wrote down somewhere. That's supposed to be the entire foundation of what we do here. He turned to the assistant manager who had emerged from a back office at the sound of the Beijing commotion, a younger man named Devin Marsh who had, notably, been standing quietly at the far end of the desk throughout the entire exchange, watching the situation unfold with visible discomfort, but saying nothing to intervene. Is there a room available tonight? Ethan asked him directly. Devin glanced nervously at his computer. We do have several rooms open, sir. I mean, Mr. Cole, the property isn't actually sold out. We're running at about 70% occupancy tonight. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing this, watching Kimberly's face as the last of her fabricated explanation collapsed entirely. So there were rooms available the whole time, he said, not really a question. You didn't turn me away because we were full. You turned me away because you looked at me and decided I couldn't afford to be here, and you were rude enough about it to suggest I try a Motel 6, 15 minutes away, rather than simply checking your own system honestly. Kimberly, to her credit, didn't try to argue or minimize what she'd done. She stood there, visibly shaking now, and said only, "You're right. I'm sorry. I was tired, and I judged you, and it was wrong. And I understand if this costs me my job." It did. Ethan, standing in the lobby of his own hotel at nearly midnight with his exhausted daughter, finally beginning to stir awake against his shoulder, made the decision that would ripple through every property in the Cole Hospitality Group over the following weeks. Kimberly Voss was terminated that same night, along with a formal note in her file documenting the specific behavior that led to it. Not out of cruelty, but because Ethan had learned, through years of running a company built on his father's simple philosophy, that the values of business claimed to hold meant absolutely nothing if there were no real consequences when someone violated them in front of the exact kind of person those values were supposed to protect. But it was what happened over the following weeks, not that single midnight moment, that would come to define this story for everyone who eventually heard it. Ava, who had woken fully during the last part of the exchange, tugged on her father's sleeve as they finally rode the elevator up to room 814, rubbing her eyes with her stuffed rabbit still clutched in one hand. "Daddy, why did that lady get fired? Was she mean to us because you didn't look like you owned the hotel? Ethan considered how to answer honestly without turning his 8-year-old daughter's bedtime into a lecture on human dignity, and settled, as he often did with Ava, for the simplest true thing he could say. She decided we didn't matter before she knew anything real about us, he said. And that's the one thing I never want you to do to anybody. Understand? It doesn't matter what somebody's wearing or how tired they look or what car they drove up in. Everybody gets treated the same, every single time. No exceptions. That's not a rule I made up for the company, baby. That's just supposed to be who we are. Ava was quiet for a moment, turning the stuffed rabbit over in her hands the way she did when she was thinking hard about something. But you didn't get mad at her for very long, she said finally, with the particular perceptiveness children sometimes surprise their parents with. You could have yelled. Grandpa says you have a temper sometimes. Ethan laughed despite himself, surprised, and admitted that his father wasn't entirely wrong about that. I didn't yell, he told her, because getting loud wouldn't have taught her anything except that I was powerful enough to be scary. I wanted her to actually understand what she did wrong, not just be scared of getting caught doing it. Those are two very different things, and only one of them actually changes a person. Ava nodded seriously, in the way only an 8-year-old processing a genuinely important lesson can nod, and said, like how you always say hi to Frank even though he just opens doors. And Ethan, surprised and quietly moved that his daughter had been paying attention to something so small, said, exactly like that. The story of what happened in the Cole Grand lobby that night might have stayed contained to a single incident report and a quiet personnel change, except that Frank Delgado, the security guard who had recognized Ethan, mentioned it the following week to a regional trainer who happened to be visiting the property, and the regional trainer, struck by how starkly the incident illustrated a gap between the company's stated values and its actual frontline behavior, brought it up during a leadership call with Ethan's senior vice president of operations. What began as an uncomfortable anecdote about a single bad night at one property became, over the following month, the foundation of something much larger. A company-wide review of how Cole Hospitality Group trained its staff to treat guests who didn't fit the polished, well-dressed profile the industry too often quietly rewarded. Ethan, who had spent 4 years conducting these anonymous property checks specifically to catch exactly this kind of failure, realized that the incident with Kimberly Voss wasn't actually an isolated bad employee. It was a symptom of a training culture that had, without anyone consciously deciding it, drifted toward optics over substance, teaching staff to prioritize guests who looked like high spenders while treating anyone who didn't fit that picture with a subtle, corrosive dismissiveness that rarely showed up in official metrics, because the guests it was aimed at rarely bothered to file a formal complaint, having learned, through years of similar treatment elsewhere, that complaining rarely changed anything. Over the following 2 months, Ethan personally rewrote the guest service training curriculum used across all 42 Cole Hospitality Group properties. Built around a single core module he insisted every employee complete, from housekeeping staff to general managers, a recorded, anonymized account of the Kimberly Voss incident, presented not as a punishment story, but as a case study in the gap between stated values and lived behavior. He included Frank Delgado's response in the training as well, holding it up as the standard every employee should aspire to, not because Frank had recognized a powerful guest, but because Frank had spent 9 years treating every single person who walked through those doors, recognized or not, with the same steady, unhurried respect, a habit built not on who might be watching, but on who Frank had decided, a long time ago, he wanted to be. The rollout wasn't universally welcomed. Several regional directors pushed back hard in the first planning meetings, arguing that the anonymous property checks were an inefficient use of an owner's time better spent on expansion, and that framing an entire company-wide training initiative around a single termination risked demoralizing staff who felt they were already doing their jobs well. Ethan heard the pushback out fully, in a way his father had taught him was itself a form of the same principle, You didn't forget to preach dignity for guests while dismissing your own people's citizens' concerns without a hearing. But he held firm on the core requirement, telling his leadership team plainly that he would rather grow more slowly with a company he was genuinely proud of than expand quickly on a foundation that quietly rotted from the inside every time no one important was watching. 2 regional directors who continued to resist the training after it launched were eventually replaced. 3 others became, somewhat to Ethan's surprise, the program's most enthusiastic internal champions, adapting the core module into role-playing exercises that new hires still worked through more than a year later. Ethan also instituted a new anonymous guest feedback channel at every property, specifically designed to capture the kind of complaint that guests like the version of himself standing at the Cole Grand desk that February night would ordinarily never bother filing, having learned through long experience that such complaints rarely changed anything. The new channel routed directly to regional leadership rather than the property itself, and within its first quarter, it surfaced 2 more incidents at different properties serious, enough to warrant termination, along with dozens of smaller pattern issues the company quietly corrected through retraining rather than punishment. Exactly the kind of systemic listening Ethan felt his father's original motel had never needed, back when the whole operation was small enough for Walter Cole to personally know every employee and every regular guest by name. Frank Delgado was promoted to Director of Guest Services for the Chicago property within the month, a decision that surprised no one who had worked alongside him and struck Frank himself as somewhat bewildering, given that all he'd done, in his own accounting of it, was treat a tired man carrying his sleeping daughter the way he tried to treat everybody. When Ethan told him about the promotion personally, over coffee in the same lobby where the whole incident had unfolded, Frank had simply said, "I don't need a fancy title for doing my job right, Mr. Cole." And Ethan had told him honestly that the title wasn't really the point. The point was making sure every new employee who walked through Cole Hospitality Group's doors understood exactly what kind of behavior actually got rewarded at this company. And it wasn't recognizing important guests. It was treating unimportant-looking ones like they mattered just as much. Kimberly Voss, for her part, did not simply disappear from the story as a cautionary tale, though Ethan could have easily let her. 3 weeks after her termination, she wrote Ethan a long, handwritten letter. Not asking for her job back, she was careful to clarify, but simply trying to explain and apologize for a mistake she said she'd been replaying every single night since it happened. She described growing up in a household where her own mother had worked 2 service jobs and had been treated with exactly the same casual dismissiveness Kimberly had shown Ethan, and how she'd promised herself as a teenager that she would never work in an industry that treated people that way. And yet here she was, 12 years into a hospitality career, having become, without ever noticing the slow drift, exactly the kind of employee she'd once resented on her own mother's behalf. She wrote about the particular exhaustion of the double shift she'd been working that night. Not as an excuse, she insisted twice in the letter, but as an honest accounting of the conditions that had let her judgment slip so badly. 12 hours on her feet, a difficult conference crowd that had complained about everything from thread count to elevator wait times, and a manager 2 shifts running who'd left her chronically understaffed at the front desk. None of it excused what she'd said to a tired father and his sleeping daughter, she wrote, but she wanted him to know she'd bypassed his, and spent the 3 weeks since turning the entire night over in her mind, trying to understand exactly the moment her thinking had gone wrong, and she believed she'd found it, the moment she'd looked at Ethan's jacket instead of his face. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, she wrote. She just wanted him to know that the incident had changed something in her, permanently, and that she intended to spend the rest of her career, wherever it ended up, making sure it never happened again, to anyone. Ethan read the letter twice, sitting in his home office with Ava doing homework at the kitchen table nearby, and found himself thinking not about punishment, but about the particular, complicated mercy his own father had shown him once, years earlier, after a much smaller mistake of Ethan's own, a mistake his father could have used to justify writing him off entirely, but hadn't, choosing instead to believe that people were generally capable of learning the hardest, lessons of their lives from a single, painful moment, if someone gave them room to actually learn it. He didn't rehire Kimberly. The decision to terminate her had been correct, and reversing it would have undercut the very message the entire training overhaul was built around. But he did write her back, a short letter of his own, telling her that he believed she meant every word, and that if she ever wanted a reference for a set position at a company willing to give her a second chance to prove she'd actually changed, she could list his name. 6 months after that midnight in the lobby of the Cole Grand, Ethan brought Ava back to Chicago for what had, by then, become a genuinely celebratory occasion. The company's first annual Guest Dignity Award, presented at a modest ceremony in the same lobby where Frank Delgado had once quietly changed the direction of an entire company simply by treating a tired stranger the way he tried to treat everyone. Frank received the inaugural award himself, visibly uncomfortable with the attention, muttering to Ethan afterward that he still didn't think he'd done anything special. Ava, now 8.5 and considerably more confident in hotel lobbies than she's Meade, stood beside her father at the small podium and, without any prompting, told the assembled staff that her dad always said everybody deserved to be treated the same, even if they look tired or their jacket has a coffee stain, because you never really know who somebody is just by looking at them. A line that got a warm, surprised laugh from the room, and that Ethan would later admit, in a quiet moment with Frank afterward, was probably the single proudest he'd ever felt in 4 years of building this company. What Ethan Cole learned that February night, and what he spent the following months trying to build permanently into the culture of everything he owned, was not really a lesson about hospitality at all, not underneath it. It was the same lesson his own father had tried to teach him 30 years earlier in a 12-room motel outside Peoria. The lesson he now hoped, more than any quarterly earnings report or 5-star review, to pass on successfully to his own daughter. That the true measure of who you are isn't how you treat the people who can do something for you. It's how you treat the people you assume can't. If this story reminded you that dignity should never depend on how tired, how ordinary, or how unimpressive someone looks standing in front of you, that's exactly the point of telling it. Like this video if it moved you. Subscribe for more stories like Ethan and Ava's, and tell us in the comments, has a stranger ever misjudged you completely? And what happened when the truth finally came out?